The air in Arthur Vincenzo's office was thick with the scent of old leather and cigar smoke, a ghost of the man who had occupied it for 50 years. Leo stood before the massive mahogany desk, his hands clasped behind his back in a posture of deference so ingrained it felt like part of his skeleton. He had stood in this room 1,000 times, always as a subordinate, always waiting for a command. Today, he stood as something else. The funeral had been a quiet affair, as per the old man's wishes. No grand spectacle. No parade of black cars snaking through the city. Just a handful of men who had been with him from the beginning, their faces carved from stone, their eyes betraying nothing. Arthur had died as he had lived. Quietly, with absolute control. Mr. Moretti, the family lawyer for 40 years, cleared his throat. The sound was like gravel scraping against glass. "Leo," he began, his voice thin and reedy. "Mr. Vincenzo left specific instructions." He pushed a thick, cream-colored envelope across the polished surface of the desk. Leo's name was written on the front in Arthur's familiar, sharp script. Just his name. Leo took the envelope. The paper felt heavy, important. His fingers trembled slightly as he broke the wax seal, a deep burgundy stamp of a single, unadorned V. He unfolded the letter. It was a single page, filled with that same precise handwriting. He read the first line. Then he read it again. The words did not seem to connect. They were a language he did not understand. "My son," it began. Leo's breath caught in his chest. A roaring sound filled his ears, like the sea crashing against a distant shore. He looked up at Moretti, his eyes wide with a question he could not voice. The old lawyer simply nodded, his expression a mixture of pity and finality. "It is true," Moretti said softly. "He never wanted you to know. He felt it was the only way to keep you safe. To let you grow strong without the burden of his name." Leo sank into the plush leather chair opposite the desk, the chair reserved for supplicants and enemies. He had never sat in it before. The letter fell from his numb fingers, drifting onto the Persian rug. "My son." 30 years. 30 years he had served this man. He had taken orders, enforced edicts, collected debts, and dispensed justice in its harshest forms. He had admired him. He had feared him. He had modeled his entire life on the quiet, unyielding strength of Arthur Vincenzo. His boss. His mentor. His father. The word was an earthquake in his soul, shattering the foundations of his entire existence. Every memory he had of the man was now suspect, tainted by this new, impossible truth. Every quiet approval, every harsh lesson, every shared moment of silence. Was it a boss mentoring his best lieutenant? Or a father teaching his son the only way he knew how? His gaze drifted across the room, searching for an anchor in the storm. He saw the rows of leather-bound books Arthur never read but liked the look of. He saw the humidor filled with cigars he would never again smoke. And then his eyes landed on it. Sitting on the corner of the desk, a strange, almost profane object in this temple of masculine power. A small, worn teddy bear, encased in a clear acrylic box like a priceless artifact. Leo had seen it every day for the last 5 years. He had never understood it. It was the one piece of the puzzle of Arthur Vincenzo that had never fit. Now, as the shock of the letter receded, replaced by a profound and aching confusion, the memory attached to that bear came rushing back. The memory of a rainy Tuesday night. The night Arthur Vincenzo broke all of his own rules. The night Leo first saw the man behind the myth, without ever understanding what he was truly seeing. Until now. Stay with me until the end, because what happens next changes everything we think we know about loyalty, family, and the lines men draw between right and wrong. I want you to do me a small favor. Like this video and hit that subscribe button so you don't miss what we have coming. And in the comments, let me know what city or country you're watching from. I love seeing where our stories reach. Now, let's get into it. The memory was so vivid it felt like the present. La Stella restaurant. The air smelled of garlic and old money. Arthur sat in his usual booth in the back, a small cup of espresso untouched before him. He was watching the rain streak down the windows, his face impassive, a mask of calm authority. Leo stood a few feet away, his back to the wall, scanning the room. It was his job to see everything. The nervous waiter, the couple arguing in whispers, the politician in the corner trying not to be seen. He was the perimeter. He was the first line of defense. And his defense was breached by a girl who could not have weighed more than 100 pounds. She slipped past the maître d', a wraith in a cheap, soaked coat, clutching a bundle of blankets to her chest. Desperation was a perfume she wore, pungent and sharp. Leo moved instantly, a reflex honed by years of practice. He intercepted her before she could take 3 steps into the main dining room. His hand was gentle but firm on her arm. "This is a private area," he said, his voice low and even. She flinched, but she did not stop. Her eyes, wide and terrified, were locked on the man in the back booth. On Arthur. "I need to see him," she pleaded, her voice a fragile whisper. "Please. I need to talk to Mr. Vincenzo." From the bundle of blankets came a soft, mewling cry. A baby. Leo's grip tightened instinctively. A child did not belong here. This world was not for children. That was one of the first lessons he had ever learned from the man she was trying to reach. "You need to leave," Leo said, a harder edge to his voice. "Now." But then another voice cut through the quiet tension of the restaurant. "Leo." It was just his name. Spoken quietly, without inflection. But it carried the force of a command that could not be disobeyed. Leo froze. He turned his head slowly. Arthur had not moved. He was still looking out the window at the rain. But he had raised a single finger from the table. A small gesture. A universe of meaning. It meant stop. It meant a wait. It meant let her pass. Leo released the woman's arm. He felt a deep sense of unease. This was a break in protocol. A serious one. No one approached Arthur unannounced. No one. The woman scurried past him, a frightened mouse darting past a sleeping cat. She stopped at the edge of the booth, clutching her baby, dripping rainwater onto the pristine floor. Arthur finally turned his gaze from the window. His eyes, the color of faded slate, settled on her. They were not angry. They were not annoyed. They were assessing. Watching. "My name is Elena," she stammered. "My husband, his name is Ricky. He works for you." Or, he did. Leo knew the name. Ricky the Rat Morales. A low-level dealer, running a small corner in the West End. Insignificant. A tiny cog in a vast machine. "They took him," she whispered, tears streaming down her face, mingling with the rain. "Silas Croft. He took him." Leo's posture stiffened. Silas Croft. The Viper. A new player. Ambitious, ruthless, and stupid. He had been making noise for months, trying to carve out a piece of Arthur's territory for himself. This was an escalation. A direct challenge. "Silas says the corner belongs to him now," Elena continued, her voice trembling so hard she could barely form the words. He said to tell you that he's holding Ricky. And if you don't give him the West End, he'll send him back in pieces. And then he'll come for her." Her gaze dropped to the sleeping baby in her arms. The room seemed to grow colder. Leo felt a familiar, cold anger begin to burn in his gut. He had seen Arthur deal with men like Silas Croft before. It was always swift. Always final. But the method was always business. Calculated. Impersonal. The rule was simple. You do not touch family. You do not involve civilians. And the most sacred rule of all, the one written in blood, was that you never, ever, brought children into their affairs. To do so was to sign your own death warrant. Silas Croft had not just signed it. He had stamped it and mailed it to hell. Leo expected Arthur to dismiss the woman. to tell her the situation would be handled. To have Leo escort her out and then issue the quiet, deadly orders. But Arthur did not. He just watched her. He watched the baby. His expression was unreadable, but Leo, who had studied that face for 3 decades, saw something flicker in the depths of his eyes. Something he had never seen before. It was not the cold anger of a boss whose territory had been challenged. It was something else. Something deeper. Something that looked almost like pain. "What is the child's name?" Arthur asked. His voice was unnaturally soft. The question caught Leo off guard. It was irrelevant. A detail that did not matter to the business at hand. "Lily," Elena whispered. "Her name is Lily." Arthur nodded slowly. "Lily." He said the name as if tasting it. As if it meant something to him. Back then, Leo had attributed it to the old man's code. The code was everything. Arthur Vincenzo was a man of principles, twisted though they might seem to the outside world. He had built an empire on loyalty, respect, and fear, but it was all governed by an unwritten constitution. And Article 1 was the sanctity of the innocent. Leo had heard the whispers, the stories that circulated to explain this strange, almost sentimental streak in a man of such profound ruthlessness. They said he had a sister, long ago. A younger sister who had been lost to the streets, swallowed by the very world he now commanded. The story went that he had been too young, too powerless to save her, and had spent the rest of his life building a fortress of power so that he would never be helpless again. He had never spoken of it. But he let the story live, a useful myth that explained his one apparent weakness. Now, sitting in the silence of the office with the letter lying on the floor, Leo understood. It was never about a sister. It was about a son. A son he had given up, cast out of his life to protect him, a son who had grown up an orphan just like him. The pain he had seen in Arthur's eyes that night was not for a long-lost sister. It was the pain of a father looking at a terrified young mother and her child, and seeing the life he could never give his own son. The family he had sacrificed. He remembered watching Arthur study Elena's face. He had asked her questions. Quiet, simple questions. Not about Silas Croft's numbers or his warehouses. Not about the business. He asked about Ricky. "Is he a good man, your husband?" Arthur had asked. Elena had nodded, tears welling again. "He is," she'd choked out. He got in over his head. Lily was sick. The doctors, the bills were so much. He was just trying to provide. "He's not like you. He's not a hard man." Arthur had listened to every word, his attention absolute. He was absorbing her story, her fear, her desperation. He was letting it inside his walls. Leo had felt a growing sense of alarm. This was dangerous. Emotion was a liability in their world. Compassion was a weakness an enemy could exploit. He'd wanted to intervene, to remind the boss of their own rules. But he remained silent, a statue of loyalty, watching a scene he could not comprehend. Finally, Arthur had seemed to reach a decision. He looked at the woman, his expression softening for a fraction of a second. "I will handle this," he said. It was a promise. In Arthur's world, a promise was a sacred bond, more binding than any contract. Elena sagged with relief, almost collapsing. "Thank you," she sobbed. "Thank you. I don't have any money. I can't pay you." She fumbled in her worn-out bag, her hands shaking. She pulled out a small, threadbare teddy bear with one button eye. "It's Lily's," she said, her voice thick with shame and desperation. "It's her favorite. It's all I have to give." She held it out, a pathetic, heartbreaking offering. She placed it on the edge of the polished table. Leo had felt a pang of pity for her, but also embarrassment. To offer such a thing to a man like Arthur Vincenzo. It was an insult, however unintentional. He expected Arthur to wave it away with disdain. But he did not. Arthur looked at the small, worn bear. He reached out a hand, his long, elegant fingers hovering over it for a moment. Then, gently, he pushed it back across the table toward her. "Keep it," he said, his voice a low murmur. "Your daughter will want it back." He paused, his eyes meeting hers. "Your gratitude is payment enough." Leo had been stunned into silence. He had seen Arthur Vincenzo turn down suitcases of cash because he didn't like the man offering it. He had seen him reject deals worth millions over a perceived slight. But he had never seen him show this kind of grace. This was not business. This was something else entirely. Arthur then turned his gaze to Leo. The softness was gone. His eyes were chips of ice. The commander was back. "Leo," he said, his voice returning to its normal, quiet authority. "Take the lady and her child somewhere safe. The suite at the Continental. Put 2 men on the door. No one gets in or out." Leo nodded. "And the husband?" Arthur's gaze was chilling. "We are going to get him." That was when Leo had tried to interject, to be the voice of reason. "Boss," he'd said, stepping closer. "A man like Croft, this is a trap. He wants to draw you out. Let me handle it. Let my team handle it. It's what we do." It was a risk, questioning a direct statement, but he felt he had to. Protecting Arthur was his primary function. Protecting him from his enemies, and sometimes, from himself. Arthur had looked at him, and for a moment, Leo thought he saw a flicker of gratitude, of appreciation for his loyalty. But his words were inflexible. "No," Arthur said simply. "This one is personal." He stood up, the first time he had moved since the woman arrived. He was not a large man, but he filled the space with an aura of absolute power. "Get the car," he commanded. "Tell Marco and Santino to meet us at the warehouse." "And Leo?" "Yes, boss." "No masks." Leo's blood ran cold. No masks. That meant something very specific. Masks were for business. They provided anonymity. Plausible deniability. They kept things clean. No masks meant this was not a transaction. It was a statement. It meant they would be seen. It meant the survivors, if any, would know exactly who had passed judgment upon them. It was Arthur's signature for his most brutal, personal work. And he had not given that order in over a decade. As Leo escorted Elena and the baby out to the car, he had tried to reconcile the 2 Arthurs he had just seen. The gentle man who had refused a child's toy as payment, and the cold executioner who had just declared a private war. He could not make them fit. Now, in the quiet office, surrounded by the ghost of the man, he finally could. They were not 2 different men. They were 2 sides of the same man. They were 2 sides of a father. The plan Arthur laid out in the back of the armored sedan was, in Leo's professional opinion, insane. It was direct, reckless, and relied on the enemy's arrogance. Silas Croft was holed up in an old shipyard warehouse on the industrial waterfront. He had at least 30 men with him, all armed, all jittery. A frontal assault would be a bloodbath. Arthur's plan was not a frontal assault. It was surgery with a sledgehammer. "Marco and his team will hit the main gate," Arthur said, his voice calm as he looked out at the passing city lights. "They will make noise. A lot of noise. Croft's men are undisciplined. They will rush to the firefight like dogs to a dinner bell. That leaves the back exposed," Leo finished for him. "The water access." Arthur nodded. "You, me, and 2 others. We go in quiet. We find the husband. And then we find Mr. Croft." "Boss, let me take the entry team," Leo had pleaded one last time. "You command from the car." "It's too risky." Arthur turned to look at him, his face illuminated by the passing streetlights. "Some things a man must do himself, Leo," he said. "This is one of them." There was no arguing with that tone. The execution was flawless, a testament to the brutal efficiency of Arthur's organization. Marco's team opened up on the front gate with a fury that sounded like a small war. Lights flashed, alarms blared, and men shouted. Just as Arthur predicted, the bulk of Croft's security team swarmed toward the chaos. Meanwhile, on the other side of the massive warehouse, four figures emerged from the cold, black water of the harbor. They were clad in black tactical gear, silent as death. Leo moved first, disabling the lone, shivering sentry on the dock with a chokehold that was as quiet as it was final. He remembered the feel of the man's life ebbing away under his hands, a familiar, grim sensation. Arthur was right behind him, moving with the quiet grace of a man half his age. They slipped through a rusted side door and into the cavernous darkness of the warehouse. The air was thick with the smell of rust, salt, and decay. They moved through the maze of shipping containers and forgotten machinery, phantoms in the night. They found Ricky Morales in a small, brightly lit office. He was tied to a chair, his face a swollen mess of bruises. He was conscious, his eyes wide with terror when they entered. One of Leo's men, Santino, quickly cut him free while the other stood guard. Ricky was sobbing, babbling about his wife, his daughter. Leo put a hand on his shoulder. "She's safe," he said. "We're getting you out." Arthur, however, was not looking at Ricky. His gaze was fixed on the adjoining room, where the sound of loud, confident laughter could be heard over the distant sounds of the firefight. Silas Croft's in a sanctum. "Get him to the boat," Arthur ordered quietly. "Then come back for me." "Boss, we go together," Leo insisted. Arthur shook his head. "He wanted my attention," he said, his voice a low growl. "I'm going to give it to him." He walked toward the door, alone. Leo hesitated for only a second before motioning for his men to get Ricky out. His orders were to obey. But he did not leave. He followed Arthur, staying in the shadows, his weapon ready. He would not let his boss walk into that room alone. He watched as Arthur pushed the door open and stepped inside. The laughter stopped instantly. Leo saw Silas Croft, a man slick with cheap cologne and arrogance, rise from his chair. His smug expression melted into one of pure shock. There were 4 other men in the room, all armed, all frozen in disbelief. "Vincenzo," Croft breathed. "You came yourself." "I'm honored." Arthur ignored him. He walked slowly into the center of the room, his eyes scanning the space. They settled on a small table littered with bottles and glasses. Among the debris was a bright pink baby's rattle. A trophy. Arthur walked to the table and picked it up. He held it in his palm, studying it. "This," Arthur said, his voice dangerously quiet, "does not belong in a place like this." He looked up, his eyes locking with Croft's. "You threatened a child, Mr. Croft. You brought a baby into our world. There are rules. Even for men like us. You have broken the only one that matters." Croft, regaining some of his bravado, sneered. "Rules are for old men. This is my city now, Vincenzo. Your time is over." He reached for the gun on his hip. He was fast. But Arthur was faster. Leo didn't even see him move. One moment, Arthur was holding the rattle. The next, a knife was in his hand, and he had crossed the room. The rattle clattered to the floor. Croft made a gurgling sound and collapsed. The other men in the room stared, paralyzed with shock. That was Leo's cue. He and Santino entered the room, weapons raised. The remaining men dropped their guns without a word. They knew it was over. They had chosen the wrong side. Arthur stood over Croft's body, his face a mask of cold fury. "Ricky Morales was a fool," he said, his voice echoing in the silent room. "But he is a father. He loves his daughter. You used that love as a weapon. You will not be bothering his family again. You will not be bothering any family. Ever again." Leo had understood the words at the time as a declaration of his boss's power and principles. Now, he heard them for what they were. The rage of a father. The primal fury of a man who had given up his own child, watching another man threaten to take one from a family that was still whole. It was the act of a man passing a sentence not just on Silas Croft, but on the cruel fate that had shaped his own life. The reunion happened at a neutral location, a small, clean apartment Arthur kept for such purposes. Leo had brought Ricky there, had him cleaned up. When Elena was brought in, holding Lily, the reunion was raw and desperate. They clung to each other, weeping. Leo had watched from the doorway, feeling the uncomfortable prickle of an emotion he usually kept buried. It was a scene from another world, a world of simple, human connections that he and Arthur could only observe from a distance. Arthur had stood beside him, watching for a long moment, his face unreadable. He had made a promise. He had kept it. After a few minutes, Ricky, his face still a patchwork of purple and blue, approached them. He tried to thank Arthur, to pledge his undying loyalty. Arthur simply raised a hand, cutting him off. "Go home," he said. "Forget this world. Be a husband. Be a father." Then Elena came forward. She was still clutching the teddy bear. She offered it to him again. "Please," she whispered. "You saved us. You have to take something." Arthur had looked at the bear, then at the sleeping child in her arms. Leo remembered the exact words he had spoken, because they had seemed so strange, so out of character. "Your daughter's safety," Arthur had said, his voice softer than Leo had ever heard it. "That is my payment. It is worth more than you know." And then came the question. The one that had echoed in Leo's mind for years. Elena looked up at the powerful, dangerous man who had just returned her world to her, her eyes filled with a mixture of terror and awe. "Who are you?" she asked. "Are you a good man?" Leo had held his breath. How did one answer such a question? How did Arthur Vincenzo, a man with a ledger drenched in red, answer that? Arthur was silent for a long time. He seemed to be looking inward, weighing the scales of his own soul. "I am what I need to be," he finally answered. His voice was heavy with a weariness Leo had never noticed before. "Tonight, for your family, I was." He then turned to Leo. "Give him the card." Leo had reached into his coat and pulled out a plain white business card. It was blank except for a single, unlisted phone number. He handed it to Ricky. "Get a real job," Arthur said to the stunned man. "Raise your little girl. Live a good life. If anyone, and I mean anyone, ever troubles you or your family again, you call this number. You are under my protection. Forever." It was a life sentence of safety. A gift of peace from the most violent man they would ever meet. As they drove away, leaving the small family to put their lives back together, Arthur had been silent. He stared out the window at the city he owned. After several minutes, Leo had broken the silence. "That was a lot of risk for one low-level dealer, boss." Arthur had not looked at him. He had just continued to watch the rain. "It wasn't about the dealer, Leo," he'd said quietly. "It was about the child." And that had been the end of it. The next day, the teddy bear appeared on his desk, encased in its acrylic prison. A memento. A reminder. Leo had thought it was a reminder of the code. Of a line that should not be crossed. He was wrong. Leo's memory faded, leaving him back in the silence at the office. The letter lay on the floor. The teddy bear sat on the desk. The last 5 years replayed in his mind, but now every frame was in color, every motive clear. He had heard that the family, the Morales, had moved away a few years later. They opened a small bakery somewhere upstate. They had another child. They were happy. Safe. They had been given a new life, paid for by the violence Arthur so carefully wielded. Leo reached out and picked up the acrylic box. It was heavy in his hand. He looked at the worn toy, its one button eye staring back at him blankly. This was not a trophy. It was a tribute. A tribute to the family Arthur could never have. A symbol of the fatherhood he could only express through power, protection, and a terrible, swift sword. Every lesson, every harsh word, every moment of grueling training Arthur had put him through, it was not to create a good soldier. It was to forge a son strong enough to survive him. Strong enough to inherit the dangerous world he had built. He had not been an employee. He had been an heir. The weight of 30 years of misunderstanding settled on him, a crushing, heartbreaking burden. He had loved the man as a boss, as a mentor. He never got the chance to love him as a father. He bent down and picked up the letter. He read the final lines. I could not give you my name, so I gave you my strength. I could not give you a home, so I gave you an empire. Forgive me for the life you have lived. It was the only way I knew to be your father. Protect what is ours. Protect the innocent. Leo folded the letter carefully and placed it in his pocket. He stood up and walked around the desk, standing where Arthur had stood for 50 years. He looked out the window at the sprawling city below. His city, now. His burden. His legacy. The question Elena had asked echoed in his mind. Are you a good man? Arthur Vincenzo was not a good man. He was not a bad man. He was something more complex, something forged in the crucible of a hard life and impossible choices. He was a father. And a father, Leo now understood, does whatever is necessary to protect his children, even if they never know his name. Strength is a tool, and like any tool, it can be used to build or to destroy. A life spent using strength for greed and power builds nothing but a gilded cage. But when that same strength is used to shield the vulnerable, to stand between the monsters and the innocent, it becomes something else entirely. It becomes a fortress. It becomes a promise. It becomes the quiet, unspoken love of a father for his son.